Hey guys, and welcome to this edition of Let's Be Blunt with Montel. The 2020 Global Cannabis Report from New Frontier Data estimates that the Latin American sales in cannabis will reach about $44.8 billion by 2025. The preferable climate and the low production costs make Latin America a promising region for the future of cannabis production and investment. Yet in many South American countries, cannabis is still an illegal crop, grown by farmers to support their families. Today's guest is a writer, photographer, and producer currently working for Vice in Mexico City. His journalistic subject matter ranges from Mexican cartels to drug smuggling to social economic equity to street art to basketball and environmental conservatism. His most recent publication for Vice News explores the world's worst weed and why we must save it. Please welcome to the show, Nathaniel Janowitz. Thank you so much, sir, for being here part of the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. The world's worst weed, my friend. I saw that as a headline and I knew we had to talk. Let's back up for a second. Let's talk about, when did you get your start in journalism? Where are you from? Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school?
I grew up in Nova Scotia, Canada, and I got involved in journalism about a decade ago. And quickly after starting, I moved to Mexico City and just never left, basically. Jumped in with both feet into the Latin American world, and especially with topics around marijuana legalization, things like that is very close to my heart because I actually did my master's degree in Colorado around the time when legalization was happening there. And I watched the whole process kind of play out from the medical marijuana cards to the day that it was actually voted to be legalized there statewide. And to me, it was just a really interesting experience watching that and then seeing it play out in other countries, whether that be Canada, where I grew up, or Uruguay, where I've also reported from. And yeah, that's a little bit about how I got into the weed reporting.
Sure, but now let's talk a little bit about how it's progressed in Mexico and Central America. Talk a little bit about what you've seen in the last. You've been down there for 10 years, you said?
Almost, about a little over 8.
Got it. So, how have you seen it progress? Did Mexico have they finally passed a medical marijuana bill?
Medical marijuana, yes. It's where the big hiccup right now is with the federal legalization.
The Mexican federal legalization?
Yeah, which would create the largest federal marketplace in the world. Like if you think about a country right now, Canada and Uruguay have a federal legalization, but their population is less than a fourth of Mexico. So we're talking about a market of 130 million that would be a recreational market, also a huge production hub, and would also, undercut one of these businesses that are causing a lot of the drug violence here in Mexico. Obviously, other drugs have now taken precedence, especially since the legalization in the U.S. and Canada has made marijuana not necessarily the principal crop that a lot of these drug cartels are working in. Now they focus more on heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, methamphetamine. So there has been a movement here in Mexico, but it has stalled in a very odd way. The medicinal movement.
It stalled because what? I guess the cartels are pissed that they're losing out on a vertical.
I wish it was that easy to explain. It seems to me there's a lack of political will. Essentially, what happened is a few years ago, the Supreme Court of Mexico ruled on a number of medical marijuana cases to the point where it got to jurisprudence. And the Supreme Court dictated that marijuana had to legalize marijuana and create a federal law. And that was, I believe, in 2018, maybe 2017. I could be getting my dates mixed up here. When that happened, they started creating this federal legalization bill, and they wrote it, and it basically just has been bouncing back and forth between the Senate and the Congress for about over 2 years. They kept missing their dates and asking for extensions until this past summer, the Supreme Court essentially just overruled and said, okay, marijuana is legal, but there's still not an actual law to outline what that means, who produces it, how the federal government plans to offer it. So it's sort of in this
Gray area.
weird gray area right now, and someone needs to get their poop together. Sorry, I'm not sure what the language requirements on this show are.
Do you think?
And really push this law through, because having this kind of ambiguous law is ridiculous, especially in a country that has such potential, not only to sell within the recreational marketplace here, but also to create it and create a medical marijuana marketplace that they could export. It just, to me, seems really short-sighted to just have this hanging out there and no one really kicking the ball forward.
Did their Supreme Court decision make it available on the street? I mean, are people selling it, and is it legal, or are you being arrested for it? Are you being arrested for it?
You won't be arrested if you're carrying like a small amount of it. But I believe if you're selling it, it's still illegal, because technically you're supposed to get a marijuana permit, but there's still no way to really get this permit, let alone like the permit to sell and produce it. So you can go get a permit to officially be able to have X amount of weed, but nobody is doing that. Nobody is going down and applying for this permit. And then they've decriminalized small amounts. So, if I was to walk down the street with a joint in my pocket, I couldn't get in trouble. Whether, some cops might try to mess with me, that's another story. But
like a tourist. I mean, I'm just thinking right now, some of our listeners are tuning in and going, wow, we'll go to Cabo because I can smoke. Yeah. Is that real? Is that right?
I would generally say if you are a foreigner in Mexico, I'd still be cautious walking down the street with marijuana. Certainly. Like I have permanent residency. I'm a legal resident here to work, to live, and I would not really walk around with marijuana. Not to say necessarily something would happen, but I don't want to come on here and give the green light to be with the green. You know what I mean?
Gotcha. And do you think that that's going to eventually sort itself out?
If you had asked me a year and a half ago, I would have said this was a done deal. This is happening. They had a law that it seemed like it was a stamp away from being federally approved. Right now, at least the activists that I'm talking to, people that are really involved in the movement, since the Supreme Court ruled this past summer, they've seen almost no political will to push forward what this actual legislation will look like. So it's really tough to say. I want to be hopeful, but I'm not seeing any signs to give me hope.
Are you thinking that they might be getting pressured from the United States?
I doubt it.
No, okay.
Because, the U.S., I think, is moving towards legalization slowly, state by state. Whether they've federally legalized, that's a different issue. But I mean, Canada didn't really receive any serious blowback from the U.S.
Well, I mean, it did and it didn't. I mean, the blowback, though we didn't sanction Canada, but at the border and border crossings, and the attitude of people coming from Canada who work in the cannabis industry, or people from the United States who work in the cannabis industry crossing borders, there's still quite a bit of angst involved in that right now.
Sure, yeah. The border is always a different issue too. I guess I was thinking more within the country.
Let's say if Canadians who run cannabis businesses fly down to Miami to visit, and then they're seen walking into a dispensary in Florida, they could be brought in and asked questions about trying to do some sort of a nefarious thing about cannabis across state or country lines. So, I've heard of harassment cases.
Yeah, certainly. Certainly there are.
And do you think if Mexico goes ahead and does something in the next year or so, could that same situation be? Then we're both sides of the border, north and south.
I mean, hypothetically, I just haven't seen anything to really make me think that the U.S. is opposed to legalization in Mexico. Whether that would mean that Mexicans, if Mexico did legalize, if Mexicans involved in the legal marijuana industry were to cross over into Texas, for example, over the border and try to go to a CBD shop, who's to say what would happen with the local police and the investigations surrounding them? I wouldn't be surprised just because of how much kind of overlap there is between the marijuana industry and other drug industries here. I'm sure the U.S. would have eyes on people coming over here because that's one of my big questions and why I think the federal law really needs to exist in Mexico is how are you going to move this product completely out of the illegal marketplace and how are you going to stop these criminal organizations that have their tentacles in so many aspects of Mexican society because drug cartels isn't even the correct word. A lot of these cartels are involved in avocado extortion. They're involved in kidnapping rackets. There's many ways they make money. And I think it would be very difficult to keep them out of the legal marijuana market if that was to happen in Mexico. So then do I think Mexican nationals involved in the legal marijuana market going to the US would probably have eyes on them? I would say they probably would.
Gotcha. So what got you interested in looking into what's going on in Paraguay?
I'm one of those people that I'm always interested in reporting in countries I've never been to, learning about countries I've never been to. And I first heard about the Paraguayan weed several years ago. I was in Uruguay, neighboring country, which in Uruguay, it's federally legalized. Marijuana is federally legalized. It was the first country to federally legalize. I did a story about that legalization movement in 2017. But when I was there, I started hearing about this like brick weed, the Paraguayan weed. It's like, yeah, you can buy the legal weed in the pharmacy. Then they have the cannabis clubs in Uruguay. But on the street, if you want the cheapest, worst weed, it's the Paraguayo. And I started hearing about that from other friends in other countries in Argentina and Chile. It's the Paraguayo. If you talk to any of these neighboring countries of Paraguay, everybody there that has dabbled in marijuana consumption has almost certainly at some point in their life tried the Paraguayo brick weed. So I had heard about this for a long time. So it was one of the stories I wanted to do. I've always had a keen interest in Paraguay. So I basically had it on my list. Some time opened up and I decided I think it's time to go down there and see what this is about firsthand. And Paraguay is a super interesting country that I've wanted to visit, I've wanted to report from, and I wanted to figure out what the deal with this weed was. And thankfully it happened.
Gotcha. And so, again, now let's talk a little bit about it because when you did hear about it, and though you heard it was, probably some of the better cheap weed that you could get, you started to hear some other things about it that made it the worst weed you could get, right?
Well, so that's one of the things that was so interesting to me about this story is, Paraguay, they say is either the third or fourth largest marijuana producing country on earth. And within the country, like when you see these flowers, they're actually very high quality. They're very high quality. They look good. But when you hear about the Paraguayan weed in other countries, it's known as the worst weed. So what is this process from taking, a plant that's actually relatively high quality and just turning it into, I don't know if trash is the right word because it's effective, but it's not an enjoyable experience, smoking it, which in my journalistic endeavor, I obviously had to try. So the marijuana in Paraguay, I don't think all the marijuana is the worst weed in the world. The worst weed in the world is the marijuana produced in Paraguay that is taken, compressed, diluted, and exported, mostly by Brazilian gangs. And that's what you find in other countries. That's the brick weed.
Do you find that brick weed coming anywhere in the United States? I would doubt it. Anybody would use it.
Nowadays, no. I mean, you hear about how the Mexicans used to package brick weed back in the day.
And the whole idea of brick weed was go back to the Golden Triangle and the actual use of packing keef in packing it ground up and packing it in, anything from molasses to honey and other things was really the way that they kind of moved it around the Golden Triangle thousands of years ago.
Yeah, and I think as the borders became more militarized with more security, that practice has picked up in other countries. Mexico used to do it, now they don't really anymore. But Paraguay has continued that, and I think you can still find brickweed in other countries. I know in Asia, like as you're saying with the Golden Triangle, at least the Asian Golden Triangle, there's a lot of that brickweed out there. You'll find it in Thailand. I remember when I was there about 10 or 11 years ago, you would find the brickweed there.
I
But now,
think, but I think in Thailand they would literally pack it in their own version of a distillate, kind of an oil, hemp oil, and use that to see if they could keep the pest out, right?
there's never a shortage of creative ways to
Right.
to move marijuana around. That's for sure.
Right. So now, what's the whole scope of the cannabis production in Paraguay? So what's going on?
Massive. It's everywhere, especially when you get into the countryside. This is something that the campesinos, the farmers, have been doing for generations, and it happens all throughout the country, but it's not legal for them to produce it. And I
But
think
then you have a law that allows for the production of cannabis.
yes, but it has to be produced by the state, and they're not including the campesinos. Nor is the state actually really producing marijuana at this point. I thought one of the most interesting things was when I was in Paraguay speaking with one of the principal marijuana activists there. He said something really interesting, and the exact quotes in the article, I don't have it in front of me, but he said to me that we're not militants of the legalization, we're militants of them following the laws we actually have. So there is a law that says that Paraguay should be producing marijuana for the medicinal marijuana industry. And they've given the permits to do that to certain producers and laboratories, but it's just not happening. And they're not including, the tens of thousands of campesinos that have been doing this for generations that already have massive fields of marijuana, cannabis in the countryside. They're not including them in this production. And when you're looking at a country like Paraguay, which is quite a poor country, even by South American standards, you're looking at this production base that already exists, that needs the help, that needs to be brought into the legal marketplace, and they're not including them. So there's the rub.
Gotcha. And so now you were able to visit a farm. What was that like for you? I mean, were there security precautions that you had to take to protect yourself and the farmers that were working there?
No, well, I mean, the usual security precautions that one would take just so that we don't give away their location. I'm
Mhm.
very, very always concerned about remaining anonymous, people who allow me access to their world. Um, but these campesinos, they're the lowest rung of the ladder. Their farms are not, prowling with security guards. I doubt they even have weapons. We're talking a rural family, 12 people living in a couple room shack in the middle of nowhere. And then you just go out the back, walk 30 feet, and there's hectares of marijuana fields. So you have to think about where they are in this ladder of the production cycle. When I say they're the lowest rung, they are selling a kilo of this cannabis for $6 US. Yeah, it was wild to me. I mean, that was one of the lowest prices I've heard anywhere in the world. So essentially, they'll work with some sort of middleman for usually these Brazilian cartels that kind of run the marijuana industry in Paraguay and in a lot of the surrounding countries, and they'll sell it directly to them. So their main danger isn't so much the criminal group, at least not from what I saw. I am certain that there have been instances of farmers probably being killed, forced off their land. I heard some stories that I wasn't able to include in the article about the dangers from that side. So I don't want to say that doesn't exist. But from the farmers that I was talking to, their main worry was actually that the police won't come and just cut down all their fields. And they were telling me that, they have to pay X amount of money per hectare, per crop to the police so that they don't come and cut down their fields. So this is just a racket that exists and a complicity that exists with certain levels of the anti-narcotics forces there. So that's more of the risk that they're taking. They're making next to no money producing this, and then a large part of it also goes towards paying these sort of protection fees to the police.
And I would think that after having the reputation of producing such poor quality in the storage and shipping portion of it, that they would pay attention to that and say, well, let's see if we can up our game. Why don't you talk a little bit about the process to make brickweed and why it is so low quality?
Sure. So I spoke to a lot of people about why the bricked weed, the Paraguayan weed especially, is such low quality. And to me, it seemed like it was a mixture of a number of factors. So just to start at the very, very beginning, one thing to know about Paraguay is it has a large agrochemical industry. Their main exports are soy, are corn, things like that. And right now, there is almost no legislation on these agrochemical giants operating in the country. So there's just a level of toxins that are spread throughout the water supply, throughout the fields, everywhere. So
So pesticides, you name it, stuff that would be banned in other countries.
Exactly. So that's
just so people understand, Paraguay is a country that's located basically right dead in the center of South America. Bordering with Bolivia, Argentina. Where's the border? Bolivia,
Brazil, Uruguay.
Uruguay.
It's one of only 2 landlocked nations in South America. So that's the first thing, is the spread of these agrochemicals. That's just something, there's issues with communities being contaminated, their water supply, and there's a lot of environmental issues just surrounding that on its own, not even connected to marijuana. But some of that certainly is getting into the marijuana. The second thing is that a lot of these farmers use their own small-scale pesticides on their crops. At the fields that I went to, they use a little spray that they put on their marijuana crops. So you're getting toxins additionally that way. Third, the production technique. A lot of these farmers have been doing this for generations, but that doesn't mean that it's a high quality process. It's still very rudimentary, especially when they're leaving it out to dry in the sun. That lowers the quality. They don't let it dry entirely and then they cover it. Little mold and things like that start to grow in it sometimes. So that's something that has to do with the rudimentary techniques. And later on, I'll get back to what they're trying to do to improve that. But that's another thing to keep in mind. So that's just the general marijuana supply. After that, once it's sold to these usually Brazilian cartels, two things happen. One, they press it into this brick weed. That creates 2 problems. When the marijuana is put into a brick weed and it's still wet, it festers on the inside, creating a mold on the inside that is very unhealthy. Secondly, they often leave the seeds inside of the marijuana when they compress it. When these seeds break apart, it unleashes this urine-y smell to it. Like when you smell this, as I said in the article, it's sort of a mix of cow shit and urine. It really did not smell that good. So, and then the final thing that happens, and this is not all the time, but I was speaking to some cannabis experts in other countries, in Chile, for example, and they say when they get the Paraguayan weed, they find chemicals, additional chemicals that they believe are put onto the marijuana after. So whether that's to create to improve the potency, to mask the smell when it crosses the border, it's unclear. But other countries are finding that the weed is then contaminated with toxins.
I mean, it sounds like to me. I mean, who the hell is smoking this stuff? They ship it to Brazil, and Brazil jacks it up that way. Are they selling it to Brazilians? They're not selling it here in the United States. I've never seen any of it.
Yeah, you find this on the streets of Brazil, on the streets of Paraguay, on the streets of Chile, on the streets of Argentina. I mean, one of the really interesting things to me is that like Paraguayans don't smoke this stuff. Like they keep the plants before it's pressed in the country. Like actually finding the brick weed in Paraguay was a bit of a task on its own that I had to take some time to actually do. But your typical Paraguayans, they don't want to smoke this crap. You know, they smoke the plants before it gets additionally contaminated. Sure, what they're smoking, the flowers may have the toxins that are already in it because of the agrochemical industry,
Sure.
because of the farmers spraying that on there, but they're not getting this brick weed. And then if you go to another country like Chile, for example, like I was talking to some people in Chile asking them about the brick weed, and they were saying that the brick weed kind of has this like romanticism to them in their mind because it reminds them almost of it's like the beginning of smoking weed. You know, it's like maybe they were a teenager or early 20s and they were, trying marijuana for the first time. The easiest, cheapest weed to get, it's the Paraguayo. Now that they're maybe more, a bit more connoisseurs, they're not smoking the Paraguayo, but they remember it as like when we first started smoking weed, that's what we found. You'd go down to the park, you'd find somebody who's selling Paraguayo in the street, pay a couple bucks, you get a big, big nugget of this brick, and it gets you pretty high. So it had this kind of romanticized idea for them. So I think the people that are smoking this are one, younger, newer marijuana smokers, two, people who can't afford anything better, because at the end of the day, it's the cheapest stuff you're going to find.
You say it gets you a little high, but does it get you sick?
Well,
Have there been any deaths reported by consuming this mess?
I've never heard about any deaths attributed to it, but I can tell you that it has a reputation for making you nauseous, giving you a headache after you smoke it. And as I told you, I'm a very serious journalist, so I had to partake. I had to try it to know what the effects were firsthand. And when I took this stuff, you have to imagine it really is like a brick. Like you can't put your fingers into it. I was having trouble breaking this stuff off the brick. I kind of had to chisel at it a little bit. Rolling the joint, I think I'm pretty good at rolling a joint. I had to use a card to cut it to actually roll the joint. Then when I smoked it, I didn't get a headache. That was what I was most worried about. But I certainly got nauseous almost immediately. And it was very harsh. The toke of it was very harsh. And each toke was harsher.
Wow.
I remember the first toke, I didn't think it was so bad. The second toke, okay, yeah, I feel it. The third toke, coughing a little bit. By the end, like I didn't finish the joint. I smoked about a third of it and I was good. I was feeling a little nauseous. I put it out, drank some water, but it hit. I mean, I definitely felt it. I was certainly stoned for a few hours after.
Did you feel like you were stoned like you would normally be from cannabis, or you were stoned because you had a little chemical added to it?
It was a little bit uneven, the high. It definitely felt like a cannabis high. Like it didn't feel different, but it felt a little all over the place, and maybe that's because I've spent the past 10 years or so that when I have smoked marijuana, I can choose the kind I want to take most of the time. You can choose if you want what kind of sensations you want. This was sort of all over the place. Like I found I was very anxious, really kind of in my head, kind of had weird energy that I wasn't expecting, and I had trouble sleeping afterwards. And the nauseousness eventually went away, but it wasn't slow to go away. I'd say it took about 45 minutes or so to feel kind of normal again, at least within my system.
It was something that you didn't want to smoke again.
Definitely not. Definitely not. There was no part of me afterwards that thought about rolling up another one. Let's put it that way.
Well, I mean, with Paraguay passing a law that claims to have been able to legalize, and the government was going to produce it, how has that affected the production of this, gray market weed?
So the legalization too, just to specify, it's legalization to produce it when it goes towards medical oils. So it's heading towards this process of medical cannabis oils. In terms of producing cannabis for the recreational market, there is no legalization on that. There is no law in Paraguay that even mentions recreational marijuana. And Paraguay in itself is a very conservative society. It has a very conservative government that's been in power for a long time. And there's not really a movement for the recreational industry. There's a movement on the medicinal side. But one of the people who I spoke to was the founder of Mama Cultiva, which is a group of generally mothers, but parents who are working towards medical marijuana or oils related to their children, usually with epilepsy or different issues with pain, but in the medical sphere. She founded the Paraguayan side of this. But with when they give these production licenses to state-run facilities and they're not producing anything, she and her colleagues still need to find marijuana for their own oils that they're making for their children. And the issue is, even with all this large scale production in the countryside, they can't buy from them. One, because it's illegal, but two, because of the
Oh,
toxins. Exactly. They can't use this weed because it's not a good enough quality to make medicinal marijuana. So basically the medicinal sphere right now is primarily around the capital of Asuncion, and it's these mothers and people related to them, in not necessarily by blood, but in their community, who are creating indoor grow operations, high quality marijuana for medicinal purposes. But that in itself is still illegal. So these mothers who fought for the law, who were the principal people that brought this and got it approved by the government, are still outside of the legal marketplace. So it's you can put a law in place, but if you don't act on it, what is the law worth anything?
So, I mean, is there anybody growing legal version of this cannabis anywhere?
It's hard to say. I mean, the activists that I were talking to were saying that these production centers from the government still aren't producing any marijuana 4 years later. I was not given access to any of these to go in and confirm that, but the government didn't tell me that they were actually producing anything. So as far as I'm seeing, no.
Wow. Well, I mean, but I don't quite understand. If everybody knows that the quality that's being produced is so bad, even the non-brick that's not exported, but what's left over, I don't understand who's consuming this crap.
Yeah, I mean, even the stuff that before it's pressed, like it has a little bit of toxins in it, but it's still pretty good weed. Like I would put it on par with, probably what you were buying in the US or Canada in the 90s, before pesticides really started being banned. It was still pretty good stuff. So your everyday cannabis smoker, I think, is smoking that in Paraguay. And also, in the cities, like I think in much of the world, there's always going to be a clandestine movement of high quality weed growers with their indoor grow ops. There's people that are selling very high quality marijuana without these toxins within Paraguay as well. So I'd say your typical Paraguayans are smoking the pre-adulterated, pre-brick weed, and That's probably, and they also move some of that outside. It's not just the brickweed that's getting into Brazil, it's getting into Chile, it's getting into Argentina, because those are not large production countries in themselves. Paraguay is really kind of fulfilling this whole area.
Well, and what's being done to see if they can improve the quality of the cannabis? Anybody working at doing that?
Yeah, I really met some interesting activists when I was there. A year ago, a little over a year ago today, it was on May 1st, International Workers' Day. There was a collective of cannabis activists who aligned themselves with a group of indigenous activists in a region called Aguarito. And they created an outdoor cannabis grow operation on the side of the highway in public view, essentially occupying this space to tell the government, you need to move forward, you need to do this. But also what they're doing is they've been connecting with campesinos all around the region in about 3 different departments. Departments are what they call states in Paraguay, and are creating similar public grow operations there, and are teaching the local campesinos how to make organic marijuana. So how to stop using these pesticides on their own plants. You know, the toxins that are just in the air, that's always going to be an issue until Paraguay cleans up their agrochemical industry. But they've aligned themselves now with, well over 1,000 farmers who have their own plantations, and teaching them how to make oils, how to stop using pesticides, how to improve their grow operations. And for most of these campesinos, they didn't know anything about this. Like the ones that I was with, they only learned about this this movement 15 days before I visited, even though it had been around for a year. So there's been a movement of people, and it's growing quickly, really trying to connect with the campesinos and show them how they can improve their quality and what their options are after they produce. Because right now, their only option is basically to sell it. And who are they selling it to? The middle people with these Brazilian cartels, and they're selling it for next to nothing. What this cooperative, this organic cooperative, is doing is showing these campesinos how they can make their own oil, how they can make hash, how they can do all sorts of different things with a product that they're familiar with. So it's happening. It's happening fast, and hopefully that will improve the quality.
I mean, what would you say the future looks like for cannabis in Paraguay?
You know, I would say it depends on the government. It really depends on the government. They have a huge opportunity to revolutionize the country if they do this correctly. And so far, they're not, at least from what I've seen. But I think there is a movement of people who realize the steps that need to be taken and are trying to figure out how to pressure the government to do that. I think the government does believe that they need to capitalize on cannabis production. One thing we haven't spoken about, and I wasn't able to focus on it much in my article, is the way that Paraguay is trying to move into the hemp space. That again is not going so well with the way that they're trying to do it, but they're trying to bring campesinos who are already creating cannabis or creating other crops to produce hemp. And they've been giving them the seeds they need and trying to bring them into this. Some of the campesinos that I were talking to said the process has gone horribly. They created the hemp and they couldn't sell it back to the government, and they basically abandoned the process.
And is the hemp coming in at like 0.3% THC, or is it?
I don't remember the exact number, but it's for industrial use. It's not
Okay.
for any kind of recreational or medicinal use.
Got
It's
it.
for industrial use. And it shows that the government is trying to figure out how to deal with marijuana cannabis production on 2 sides, the medicinal industry and the industrial hemp industry. But it just seems like they're doing it really poorly. But all of this has happened in the last 5 years. So what will the future look like? It's hard to say. I think it really amounts to whether the government will take the steps they need to take, follow through on the laws they have, and create new laws. Because I think there's a lot of movement in the region outside of Paraguay, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Chile, for a recreational market. Paraguay could really feed this recreational market. It could feed the medicinal market. It could feed the industrial market all at once. And the government doesn't seem to be moving into that third sphere at all. And I think if they really want to improve the quality of life for your average campesino, there are three ways to do that: industrial, medicinal, and through recreation. So they just need to take the steps. They have a huge potential in that country. If you're the third or fourth largest producing marijuana country in the world, you're the by far the largest in South America. The potential is immense, and I think the government needs to move forward on that.
You probably know this, but I mean, what is the tourism rate of Americans going to Paraguay?
Not that It's not that high in terms of Americans. Certainly, there are American tourists, um, but it actually has a lot of European tourists. Strangely enough, Paraguay is, after Argentina and Brazil, the third largest expat group in the country. Besides these two neighboring countries where you're obviously going to have a lot of spillover, the third largest are Germans, followed by a number of European countries. There's a huge movement of Europeans that are moving there, that are traveling there, and it's pretty wild. Like, I went to some places where I'd go to a restaurant, and I speak fluent Spanish, but I'm very used to, in Mexico or in even other countries like Chile or Costa Rica, they might bring me a menu in English. In Paraguay, they'd bring me a menu in German, which I thought was really, really kind of odd. So there's definitely an expat scene, but it's more European than American.
Well, I mean, Let's Be Blunt is seen all over the world, and we've got guests on it from all over the world. So I only brought that up just to see if we want to shout out a little warning to those going down there that maybe if you decide that you want to try to partake in some Paraguay weeds, you need to make sure you know where it's coming from.
You know what I would say? I would say if you go to Paraguay, the flowers will be all right if you smoke it there. If you go to Brazil, or you go to Argentina, or you go to Chile, don't buy anything called Paraguayo, because that was one thing that, like, the Paraguayans really, especially the ones who are more involved in the recreational movement, they're like, we don't even smoke that crappy weed. That stuff's hard to find here. If you go to Brazil and someone's saying, "Oh, this is Paraguayo," and they're trying to give you brick weed, stay away from that.
Stay away from that. Well, my friend, thank you so much. When will this report air on Vice?
It's already out. Came out on
Already,
420.
huh? Say that again.
Came out on 420.
Oh, perfect, perfect. And it's probably repeating itself right now, so we get a chance to see it. People want to watch it. If they wanted to get more information, do you have a website or anything that people can go to?
Yeah, I mean, obviously Vice News, and you can check my personal website, NathanielJanowitz.com.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Nathaniel, for being a part of the show today, man. Really, really interesting stuff. I think, people need to understand that, as quickly as America seems to have moved forward, people don't know that well over 40 countries around the world have now legalized in some way, shape, or form, or at least taken themselves out of the international treaty that banned hemp. So, there's cannabis available around the world. I think this year Germany may go ahead and pass its own adult use law. Have you heard that?
Yeah, I think the movement's happening everywhere. I personally am of the mode of thinking that within the next 10 or 15 years, a lot of the world is going to be federally legalized. I think there's a movement happening. It's happening. I wouldn't even say it's happening slowly. If you look where we were 15 years ago when I first moved to Colorado and they just passed medical marijuana card licenses compared to where we are now, I think in 10, 15 years, we're going to make leaps and bounds all across the world.
Your lips to God's ears. I don't know, with the recent, conservative rollback on personal rights by one group in this country. I'm afraid that people who ignore what just happened this week when it comes to the leaked document about possibility of rolling back Roe versus Wade, that rolls back personal liberties. And I wouldn't put it past this group to attempt to roll back all the successes that have already happened with cannabis nationwide, and they could do so just with the stroke of a pen. I mean, because you got to remember, most people in this country don't remember that the U.S. government owns the patent on CBD in the United States. The second that they want to say, oh, by the way, you're infringing on my patent, and anybody who's doing so, you're going to jail, they can shut down every dispensary in America.
Mm-hmm.
Just like that. Stroke of a pen. We're going to enforce our patent, and nothing you can say about it. So, we have to stay vigilant, especially those that are in the movement, but keep an eye on the prize of what's going on around the world. I've been talking to companies out of Lesotho, South Africa, out of Colombia, groups out of Argentina, all of whom are trying to get into the cannabis movement. So I think you may be right, though. I think the rest of the world is going to come to an understanding before we do.
Could happen that way. It could happen that way. Hopefully not. But maybe by then Mexico will be federal legalized and people can just hop over the border.
There you go, for sure. Like they can right now in Canada and go visit because we do recognize that I think it's like 30% of the people who are traveling right now have been actually saying that cannabis tourism is part of the reason for their travel.
Yeah, and I think other countries are starting to realize that too. I think that's one of the reasons why there is a movement in so many other countries around the world because it's you know it's really interesting in Canada right now. Some of the places you can go and the experiences you can have that include marijuana. And even in Colorado and things like that. And I think Mexico has a great opportunity to really move towards cannabis tourism. Uruguay already has it happening. Paraguay, I mean, it's going to be happening more and more around the world. It's just a great way to make money for other countries. Like, why would you not do it?
Absolutely. And, we're just at the tip of the iceberg with using a plant and the multiple ways that it can be used. So, again, I got to say thank you, sir, for being on the show. Anytime you have something that you want to drop, we'd love to have you back. You have an open invitation to come on back and let's be blunt. I also do another one. It's called Free Thinking. So either one of those, if you want to be on, let me know, and we will definitely have you back, Nathaniel.
Sounds good.
Absolutely, sir. Well, thank you so much for being a part of Let's Be Blunt today, and thank you for tuning in to Let's Be Blunt with Montel. Thanks for joining me on Let's Be Blunt with Montel. Please make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell to be notified when new episodes post each week. We'd love to hear your feedback also, so please send us your comments.